Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I mean, there is still a pending issue to be able to meet in person, right? We've tried a couple of times, but we have never quite managed. So hopefully next time we'll be able to do it in person and not on Zoom. But in the meantime, it's great to see you all on Zoom and have a chance to share our research and have a nice conversation. Well, I guess it's my fault from this short video I sent you, right? Like you read the robotics and AI bit, and then maybe that's a good way to, as you saw, we could just stick in a few slides. So maybe that's a good way to get started. Because so this is the extra bit I just added. Just to give you an idea of why there is an interest in this field. This was some project we had a few years ago. We just finished, this funding is done. We finished this project last December. And it was a project on plant intelligence for robotics and AI, right? So in a sense, if you think about it, we are so obsessed with ourselves, right? With this anthropocentric point of view that we can't get rid of. And if anything, we think, okay, if we are gonna bio-inspire our robotics and our AIs, by default, we think of how to inspire it in animal models, right? Animal models that can locomote, right? If you have an animal locomoting, exploring the surface of, such as here, the red planet, Mars, you might think, okay, let's build a robot, let's do a rover that can cruise around Mars and sample the terrain, whatever it is that NASA is doing. And you might think that I insist on the idea of by default. If we don't give it too much thought, we think, okay, whichever gadget, whichever toy we make, this rover has to be on wheels or on legs or whichever other way it has to explore, to move around, because you want your rover to move from point A to point B, to move, to locomote, right? To reach out into, somewhere else, into a target. And to get to the target, it's got to walk or whatever. And then when we think about it, we say, okay, maybe we are being too much obsessed with the inspiration that animals provide. And if you think of a plant model, plants are way more decentralized. Of course, we don't think of a central nervous system. There is not a command center. Everything is distributed, fully distributed. And yet, you can see what happens here. If you see this is a wild type of rice, and this is a knockdown gene mutant of rice. And if you see how the one at the top moves, this is the root, right? It's got to explore around, right? It's important to understand what's happening here. The way it's exploring is simply by circumnautating. That's something Darwin was able to. Actually, the word to circumnutate is a term that Darwin coined in the 19th century, right? So to circumnutate, to nod. So the root is like doing like this. It's circumnutating, is nodding around, is just oscillating. The tip is just like doing like this. This pattern of movement allows the root to exhibit this exploratory pattern of behavior. So it's exploring. If you see the one at the bottom is the one that cannot circumnutate because of this gene that has been knocked down, and unable to circumnutate, you see the pattern of movement is completely, circular. It's not exploring as the one on the top. It's simply, as soon as it touches the floor, it just goes in circles, right? And then, of course, starts secondary root growth, whatever. But it has nothing to do with the type of exploratory pattern that you find here at the root of at the top, right? Now, if you want to devise a robot inspired on plants and not on animals, we call it a growbot, a robot that grows, right? So it's a growing robot, a growbot. Look at the difference you'll see now when I click play. Look at the difference in between the robot here, that the one able to circumnutate, and the robot that is unable to circumnutate. Let me press play. You see now, okay? You see the robot growing. The robot on the left, because it's circumnutating, you see it's able to avoid obstacles. right? So it's avoiding obstacles as a byproduct, as the emergent result of the way it's interacting with the surroundings. You see the one on the right is stuck. As soon as it finds an obstacle, it gets stuck because it doesn't circumnutate. It's unable to, avoid the obstacle. So this is a robot that has a number of properties. Its first is soft, so it's made with soft materials. We know in robotics you can have soft robots, of course, and we can deliver the goods by means of the properties of the materials of those soft robots, right? But they are usually almost exclusively being inspired on animal models. So you have good soft robotics inspired on elephant trunks, on jellyfish, on you name it, whatever. Any soft material, but still animal material. And then we don't understand that you can reach, like the rover you saw before, this rover, you can reach your destination. You can reach your destination not through locomotion, but through growth. So if you think of a rover on wheels exploring Mars, and there is a crack, or there is a slope, or there is a sand dune, any obstacle, any hurdle, it might get stuck. If your rover, the wheel gets stuck into the crack, it will be there for years. And then you have burned a lot of money. And NASA doesn't want you to waste all this money, right? Costs a fortune to put a rover on Mars to then get stuck into a crack. But if you grow as a growbot, if you think of these growbots grow over the cracks. So for example, if there is a growbot, you will see that there is a crack, never mind, I can grow over the crack. It's like if you think of a hanging bridge, right? If you are on this riverbank and you want to swim across the river and get to the other side of the river, if the current is strong, you need to know how strong it is because you need to swim. But if you are like a hanging bridge growing on top of the river, like a bridge, you don't care about the current, you see? So inspiring your robots based on plant models rather than animal models sometimes can pay off in rather interesting ways. So that's one reason to inspire your robotics on plant models, right? So basically what we do is it's in our lab we try to unearth, to understand plant intelligence by picking through two windows. One is the overt behavior, right? Overt behavior of plants. And that's something you do basically with time lapse. So we can time lapse. I'll show you now some videos. You can time lapse video plants. So that's something we do on these caverns. You can see their behavior. You can see how they grow to reach a target. Say if it's a climbing plant, or roots, as we saw before in the case of roots, they need to reach some nutrient patch, whatever. But then we can do something else. You can, on top of observing their overt behavior through time-lapse photography, you can insert a pair of needles and register their electrical activity. So you can monitor, you can register their electrophysiological activity. In a way, if you think about it, in the very same way that we can speak in animal studies of the neural correlates of consciousness or the neural correlates of this cognitive ability, you can likewise speak of the electrophysiological correlates, like the non-neural correlates. Of course, plants have no neurons, right? But you can still speak of the electrophysiological correlates of whichever plant competency you care about, right? So we have these two windows, these two ways of picking into the doings of plants, overt behavior or the correlates, if you think from the inside out, right? Now, it's not that easy, okay? I thought it has to do with in a sense, this idea, even in the case of robotics, that we are obsessed with ourselves or with animal models, and we don't see how to inspire our robotics or our AIs with plant or with sessile organisms. It's something that belongs, in a sense, to our Western scientific tradition, right? I speak of this in the preface of Planta Sapiens of the book. I speak about this bias that we all have as navel gazing. We can't help but looking our belly button, right? We look at ourselves and say, okay, whichever system I try to construct, to build, I'm gonna, base it on either ourselves or any other animal belonging to the animal kingdom. Now, I had this we had this gathering with scientists in the residency of the Dalai Lama before summer, and I handed a copy of my book, and I told him, His Holiness, I said something like, plants are sapient, right? Plants are sapient. Plants are sapient, or plants are intelligent. Basically what boils down to, right? Either consciousness or cognition, but plants are cognitive, or plants are sentient to some extent, right? And what do you reckon? What do you reckon his attitude was? What do you think the Dalai Lama responded when I said plants are sentient? Right. Yeah, that's we can get there. I mean, we can certainly get to that question during the Q&A, because that's something people always tell me. I mean, when I give a talk on plant intelligence, there is always somebody raising their hands and say, hey, now what? I was a vegan, I thought I was safe, now what? You ruined my day, right? You ruined my day.
No.
Good. Well, surprise, 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 this is what the Dalai Lama said. Literally, he said, no way, no way. And he gave me a copy of his book in return. So literally, I was flying back to Spain with a copy of his book. And this is His Holiness book. And look what he says here. I was reading this on the plane, and I thought, oh my God, this is it. If an organism can move its whole body from one place to another, then it may be regarded as a sentient being. You see, he's doing exactly the same connection that our friends, the engineers sending rovers to Mars, were doing for robotics and AI. You assume that in order to explore, you have to locomote, and you assume that in order to be sentient, you have to locomote. So what is so marvelous about locomotion? It seems like we can help it, but if you locomote, you are okay. If you don't locomote, that's it, end of the story, right? So it's funny because even in the case in which we are clearly inspiring our robotics and our systems in animal models, even here in this gathering with Buddhist monks and Western scientists, I found that they were all fine when it came to discussing the possibility of the emergence of sentience in AI systems. So, I mean, that's amazing. They say, no way, plants will never be sentient because they cannot locomote. And then they don't stick to the animal kingdom, like sort of saying, oh, you've got to be an animal. They are even eager or open-minded enough to say, sure, maybe not today's AI, but some future AI or robotics might be able to deliver its own type of sentience. So sentience might emerge in future AI, right? So they are open to that possibility, something which is, years from today and may never happen. But the one you have up your nose, so the one you have here, I mean bacteria, fungi, protists, plants. So any form of life whatsoever other than animals, we neglect it. We just reject it. No way. You cannot be sentient. You cannot be intelligent. And then you have these, things made out of screws and nuts and, and wires and you name it, and we are open to that. So that's something I find quite revealing about our biases, right? Now, and something that we don't get, is something that Darwin saw a long time ago, and is that we shouldn't see the relation in between kings in the tree of life as a relation of subordination. So it's a relation in between equals. Plants, they don't have It's not their fault. It's not their fault that you have to go shopping to cook dinner. I mean, if you locomote and you have to locomote to cook, to find food, to hunt, to avoid being hunted, that's not their business. We found different ways of doing things. They incorporated from cyanobacteria, they incorporated the chloroplasts, right, to do photosynthesis, to make their own foodstuff out of sun energy. And the fact that they don't need to go shopping and they can remain rooted and they are sessile, it simply means that they encounter a whole different set of problems. So they have different problems, they find different solutions to deal with their own type of problems. They apply a divide and conquer strategy, right? So you won't find into a plant an organ located somehow, like a place where this organ is located, a heart, 2 kidneys, 2 lungs. They don't have to, because they are sessile. They couldn't afford to. So we can afford to because we can locomote, we can flee, we can escape from a predator. But they cannot. Their strategy is to divide and conquer. So nothing is located, nothing essentially is located in a place. You cut a branch off, they grow another branch. If I cut you an arm off, you don't grow another arm, right? So it's neither better nor worse. It's that they have their own problems, they have their own solutions. But there is not a relation of subordination. That's the very important message. And we don't get it. We find a hierarchical relationship of subordination in between the two, right? If we have, of course, I said before that we have 2 ways to peek into their doings. One is by observing their overt behavior, right? Their overt behavior, some people complain that hey, it's not clear what we mean by behavior, right? Of course, behavior cannot boil down to their patterns of development. So developmental stages are part of development. They are not behavioral repertoires or behavioral patterns themselves, right? But we can speak clearly of the way coordinated responses in the face of different set of stimuli, telling them apart from simply developmental changes can be understood as behavior. In fact, some other people, like Fatima Krakova, she speaks of the consequences of the choices they make in response to those stimuli. So if we can have a way to study, to operationalize, to observe those consequences in terms of the choices they are making as different parameters, different stimuli are impinging on their sensory surface, then we have a way to observe their behavior. Of course, their behavior differs from ours. We simply need to find a definition of behavior which is wide enough to encompass any type of behavior in a relation which is not a relation of subordination, right? And when you do that, you start to see amazing patterns of behavior. We know that some plants like cuscuta, for those of you not familiar, is one of these parasitarian plants that they don't have chlorophyll, so they cannot do photosynthesis, and they need to find real fast early in development, in the early stage of development, they need to find a host, a target plant that they can twine around and suck up their sugars, right? So it clearly, they really need to fine-tune their sensory mechanisms to detect those hosts and latch onto them, target them, and go there, get there, right? So this is just a cuscuta growing onto a host plant. You see, this case is clearly sensing the host to the left, and it's growing in such a way that it's able to reach it. Once it reaches and coils around, then it will start to, you see here, it will start to develop to drill it. So it will go through drilling, go through the phloem, through the vascular system of the plant to suck up the nutrients and start to grow from there, right? So it's easy in this case. In the case of cuscuta, we can time lapse it and we can see how it reaches for the host plant. We understand the adaptive behavior itself. But some people might say, oh, this is just a mere adaptation, right? So no big deal, no, It's not such a big deal. It's just an adaptation. What is the choice here being made, right? Well, if we are speaking of plant behavior and we are speaking of the observable consequences of the choices being made, that's something we can truly study with Cuscuta. That's the guy in the center. The yellowish guy in the center is yellowish. It's not greenish because it has no chlorophyll. And you see it's doing pretty well here. It's covering a whole host tree and sucking it up, right? It's really, really doing well. But what's more important is that it's able to pick and to choose in between two different hosts. So it's not simply, oh, lucky me, I found this target to my left. It's that if they are being given two hosts, if they can choose in between two of them, they will select the one that is better in terms of nutrient energy and the rest. So if it's wheat versus tomato, they will clearly go for tomato, right? It's way more juicy than wheat. We know quite a lot about what's going on here. In fact, there are two stages. You saw before is reaching for the host and then coiling around, right? So just think that simply, just think what's happening here. Cuscuta has these photosensitive proteins, sensitive to different parts of the light spectrum, because plants absorb red, right, and blue. That's why you see them green, right? So they absorb red and blue, and far red goes through, right, or gets reflected. So the ratio of red to far red light is being very informative if you think about it. So the host or the plants in the vicinity will be absorbing red and will be letting far red go through or reflected. So that ratio, and the same goes for the ratio of blue to green, those ratios are highly informative because the way those ratios go up or down is telling you if there is a plant in the vicinity, a potential host in the vicinity, right? So out of those amounts and ratios, you can tell, or Cuscuta should be able to tell size and shape, distance, proximity, amount of chlorophyll content, and then be able to tell, to judge how much sugar is there for me to suck up. And of course, on top of that, the host plant is emitting all these volatiles, organic volatile compounds, so all these molecules, airborne, being emitted into the air, and the plant, the Cuscuta, will be sensing it likewise. So all this is information that the Cuscuta is going to be processing in order to direct, so to control the pattern of growth one way or another, right? On top of that, there is also information related to sound, so mechanosensorial information. That's something that is really recent, very recent research, and it's still, you know, waiting to be replicated. It's recent research from 2022 or 2023, 24. So it's still, we've got to be cautious with this research. But there is a line of research called phytoacoustics, and plants might even be integrating those light-related cues, chemical cues, with acoustic cues. And out of all this information, make up a picture in which they say, okay, good, now I know I want to go grow this way or grow this other way because it pays off, because it's not worthy growing towards the wheat or growing towards the tomato, right? So you see that this is way more complex than simply saying, oh yeah, sure, I'm just gonna grow and see what happens, right? It's never see what happens. There is a clear, if I may, intentionality underneath, right? Now, we have very sophisticated equipment to measure, say, amount of sucrose within a plant, and now you have like really you know, nanotechnology and very sophisticated sensors to give you really good precision of what's going on within the vascular system of the plant. So if you think of the xylem and the phloem pathways, so like where the sugars, the nutrients, the water is going up or down the tree, you can have a picture of how all those substances are being, how they are being translocated from one point to another, from the leaves to the roots, or vice versa, from the roots to the shoots, right? So all this bidirectional trafficking is taking place throughout the vascular system of the tree. And we can have in fact, we can have incredibly complex spatiotemporal metabolic maps of all this going on. Like in the very same way you have that in the case of animal subjects. So you can combine good spatiotemporal resolution by putting together, magnetic resonance imaging with PET scans. You can have those in the case of plants too, right? Now, what's the trick here is that we want to approach plant behavior and we want to approach the study of plant sentience from the point of view of the cognitive sciences. So this is not plant physiology. We are not doing plant physiology, we are doing plant cognitive science. And doing plant cognitive science requires that we understand that the vascular system of the plant, those pathways, the xylem and the phloem, that we see all these sugars and water and nutrients flowing up and down the plant body, are not going to be treated, or we don't want to see them as simply a physiological system akin to the circulatory system of an animal. So we are not talking about the circulation of substances, right? We are talking about the processing of information. So from a cognitive science perspective, if we are going to be doing a plant cognitive science, we are speaking of plant information processing, right? So think that we said that plants are fully decentralized. They apply this divide and conquer strategy. There is no command center. There is no central nervous system. They have no neurons. Everything is fully distributed throughout the whole plant body, right? That doesn't mean that there is no need to orchestrate, to communicate, to organize their patterns of response in a way that makes sense from the point of view of the whole plant as an organism. So it's not like this shoot or this root is responding this way or responding that way. Is that there is a global response, adaptively, global response, right? So this requires that we make sense of long-distance signaling throughout the plant body. And electrical signaling is part of the equation. There is chemical, hydraulic, volatiles, Ross waves, calcium waves. So there's all these things going on that are put to the service of providing a way to respond systemically, okay? Systemically. So this is important because some people misunderstand the project and say, okay, you can have a great understanding of the physiology or of the cellular or molecular plant biology, but we would be missing what's at stake. We are treating the organism as such and the organism in relation to the surroundings. We want to understand the meaning making that the plant is doing. The cuscuta is doing some meaning making. It's want to understand its relation to the surroundings. Oh, there is wheat here, there is tomato here. I want to grow left and not right, whatever, right? So I insist we need to understand plants from an information processing perspective, right? In fact, some years ago, we took some time to list some of the parameters, both biotic and abiotic, right, that plants might care to monitor. And the list is never ending. It keeps growing, right? This is just a handful of parameters that plants do care about. Now, here, I won't go through them. This is just to convey the idea that they are not responding to touch or to wind or to being shaken or to being swayed or to variations in the water supply or to whatever, you name it. They won't be responding to any of those on a one-to-one basis. They need to be using that, integrating it in such a way that they can put it all together and integrate it and provide a response that is globally adaptive. That's why we need to be speaking of this systemic signaling in the context of a plant cognitive science, right? So once you do that, then you can say, oh, now it does make sense to speak of plant decision making. Okay, they need to make their own decisions. Or kin recognition. We know they recognize kin and distinguish kin from non-kin, and depending whether you are kin or not kin, I'm going to behave differently. I might not want to compete with you, but I might want to compete with this other guy over here. So they are able to sense risk and behave accordingly in terms of the needs they might have. So it's not pre-programmed responses. They need to do things. They need to behave anticipatorily, right? Because it doesn't pay off to say, hey, I'm going to grow to my left because that's where it's worth growing. No, I want to know where it's going to be worth growing in the near future, because it's going to take me some time to get there, right? So behavior has got to be anticipatory behavior. They might be able to learn. We'll speak about that. They forage and compete for resources. They need to be doing many things. They are able to mimic their surroundings. They exhibit sometimes proto-numerical abilities, like we know chicken or fish or honeybees do, right? So if you see, most of the competencies that animal cognition researchers are starting to unearth are starting, I mean, in phyla that are not privileged, like don't have a neocortex. We know primates and mammals, endowed with a neocortex, we are far too used to knowing what these smart guys are able to do because they resemble us. But we forgot about ours. We want to get rid of ourselves as providing the gold standard. We don't provide any gold standard. We want to go to other phyla and say, oh, invertebrates, oh, honeybees, termites, Drosophila, flies, ants, cephalopods. So all these other guys that don't have a neocortex and yet belong to the animal kingdom, we know they are able to perform many of these competencies that you see now here on the slide. And by the same token, the question arises as to whether plants are able to perform those competencies likewise. If you see I'm being very careful here, I'm not claiming they do perform those competencies. I'm claiming that the scientific question is legitimate. We can raise the scientific question and study it scientifically. We can say, hey, can plants learn? Can plants memorize? Can plants make decisions? Can plants behave anticipatorily? So we can say that, we can ask these questions in the very same way that we raise those questions for animal systems, right? So that's what I meant about not having a relation of subordination. Now, this is funny because even if we are into cognition and we are open enough to consider the very possibility of plant cognition, some people go and say, hey, hold on a sec, sentience is a whole different game. Your plants might be intelligent, but sentience is a whole different thing. And people like Eva Jablonka and some others will tell you that sentience, okay, the minimal state of consciousness, let's call it sentience, call it awareness of the external surroundings, perceiving the external world, or perceiving internal states, or perceiving things related to my own movement. That might be the tip that tells you, a hint that tells you that this animal is at least minimally sentient. If it's able to perform esteroception, interoception, or proprioception, right? This is Jonathan Birch, a collaborator of Eva Jablonka. They speak of these things like as we said before, integration. Remember, we say, oh, plants, systemic signaling, they want to integrate all these incoming channels of information. Oh, they say, well, hold on a sec. On top of esteroception, interoception, and proprioception, if an animal is able to somehow integrate all this, that might be a clue, that might suggest that this animal is sentient, however minimally. If they are subject to being anesthetized, that might be another cue. If they are able to learn, some form, of course, not just very rudimentary or very primitive forms of learning, but some form of enhanced learning, they might be sentient. Or so these are called markers. These are called indicators of sentience. And I won't go through this list because I just want you to pay attention to what I'm going to do in a moment. Okay, you just see a huge list of criteria. This is the set of indicators or markers that Jonathan Birch is thinking of. Look what I'm going to do now. You see, we are obsessed with animals. If this is a set of markers and it is an open empirical question which organisms in the tree of life end up being sentient, why don't we present these markers in a kingdom neutral way and simply speak of organisms? Why do you assume by default that the organism exhibiting capacity to integrate sensory information, to integrate nociception, to be subject to analgesics, to blah, 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 has got to be an animal? You see what I mean? Because it's not just being an animal. If you look at integrated nociception, number 3, it says the animal possesses neural pathways. Well, that is a problem, because of course, if you are linking the emergence of sentience to the possession of neural pathways, you can only be sentient to the extent that you have neurons and neural tissue. But that is an open empirical question, right? I would like to think. I'm not claiming plants have got to be sentient. I'm claiming that these criteria are not neutral and don't allow you to. The good news is that it's very easy to make them neutral. Just cross animal and write organism, cross neural and write information processing tissue, right? So just don't customize it for neural-based animal systems and keep it open enough. And then we can stick to those criteria and check whether those criteria are being met by non-neural, non-animal life forms. You see? We did something like that in this target article. We did something, we discussed, you just pay attention to the question mark. We don't say plant sentience, we say plant sentience between romanticism and denial science. So we are saying, let's do the science. We don't need to deny or to accept by default their sentience. We just need to be able to discuss it scientifically. Are they sentient? Well, let's try to apply those criteria, right? And our target article was followed by a set of commentaries by many people. We have 30-something commentaries. Now we wrote a response to commentaries. And look, questions being raised go from, questioning the scientific nature of the enterprise, to the language, the terminology being used, to who has the burden of proof, to what we mean by learning. So many, many issues. We cannot cover them all here for sure. But just let me illustrate what's going on here with a couple of examples. Luckily, we can move beyond tailor-made definitions for animal systems. If you think of action potentials, like the firing of action potentials, we don't need to tie them too closely to neural tissue. Of course, we know that it has to do with the exchange of electrical potential, right? Associated with the way the passage of the impulse, the electrical impulse along the cell's membrane. But that cell membrane doesn't need to be a neuronal membrane. In fact, plant cells fire action potentials, right? So intriguingly, if you go to plant physiology, people are not usually educated into this. So if you go through plant biology textbooks, you won't find much about plant action potentials. It feels like something anecdotal, like, oh yeah, sure, the Venus flytrap, it fires action potentials and then snapshots the carnivorous plant, or the mimosa folding its leaves. But action potentials are being used by plants round the clock for many, many different functions, right? So in fact, here you have the one on the left is an animal action potential, it's a neuronal action potential, like and the one on the right is the plant one. So if you see, what changes is simply the temporal scale. The one to the, I didn't put it in the plot, the one on the left, the neuronal one, we are speaking of milliseconds, right? The one on the right, we are speaking of 3-4 seconds. Why? Because plants are slower? Sure. But remember, there is not a relation of subordination. Plants are not slower than animals. They are unfolding their behaviors at the right time scale they need to do what they need to be doing. So we don't need to be comparing them to an animal to say, oh, how slow they are. No, they are just well adaptive to what they need to be doing. So their time scale is 3-4 seconds. But the functional profile, and this is what counts, the electrophysiological profile remains the same. So if you see the wave of depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, so the threefold phases of an action potential, the textbook plot of an action potential is the very same one you find in both neuronal and non-neuronal cells. Okay, so it depolarizes, repolarizes, hyperpolarizes, and that's taking place both in neurons and in plant cells. It just changes the type of channels, the type of ions involved, calcium, sodium, chloride. So it changes in the different systems. It changed the resting potential. They have different resting potentials, minus 70 millivolts or minus 150 millivolts, whatever. But the profile, the functional profile is what counts. We are able to resort to this profile to do our planty things, right? You don't need to be an animal to do that. In fact, this is funny because in this target article I was mentioning, our commentators are criticizing the language we employ, like saying, oh, plants don't have neurotransmitters, they claim, okay? And then when we speak of glutamate and GABA and the rest of it, I mean, all these neurotransmitters, we know these molecules are there in plants, and some of them are not mere metabolites. So they have a signaling role. They play a signaling role, as we see in animals, right? So glutamate and GABA, if you see here, there is just a recent study. Well, this is, they just published another study. This is from 2018. Now they have published something else, but doesn't really matter. What counts is the fact that this signaling role, a proper signaling role, I insist, not just a metabolite, is being played in the case of glutamate, and the same for GABA. So if you see here, you're going to see, I'm going to press play, pay attention to the bottom. You'll see a caterpillar munching onto the leaf, and then you'll see a calcium-based wave being triggered by glutamate release. This glutamate release is triggering this calcium wave that will put in motion all this defensive machinery to defend against the caterpillar attack. And this is systemic. So it's a calcium wave spreading throughout the plant body to put in motion that defensive mechanisms at other points of the plant body, right? So you see, now it's munching on, you see now it's spreading, the calcium wave is spreading all over the plant. You'll see it here. Here, this is easier to see. The point of insertion of where they are putting exogenous glutamate. See now what happens. You'll see how the calcium wave spreads throughout the whole plant. Now you see, look at that. Okay, so intriguingly, when this takes place, you know what is the response? The response is no. This cannot be a neurotransmitter because the dictionary definition of neurotransmitter speaks of synapses. You need to breach a synapse for neurotransmission. If there are no synapses to be breached, there are no neurotransmission. You see, instead of the denial of the signaling role that this molecule is playing, instead of denying that, why don't we change our dictionary definitions to make them more encompassing and say, hey, hold on a sec, maybe for proper signaling, the signaling role, it doesn't matter if there is a synapse or not, because we know that in plants that have no neurons, electrical signals can spread throughout the continuous flowing pathways. You don't need to breach synapses, and thereby neurotransmitters strictly connected to the idea of a synapse to be breached makes no sense in systems that lack synapses. Instead of saying, no, you don't have synapses, you cannot be doing signaling the way we do, right? You see what I mean? So we can have way more encompassing definitions that don't leave anybody out. What happens in the case of anesthesia? Well, if you think about it, all these plants can be anesthetized. I won't go through them all because we are running short of time, but just look what happens with mimosa. Mimosa, we don't even need to time lapse them, right? So you can, if you touch mimosa, you see at the top, you touch it and it will fall, right? You know what mimosa does, right? You touch it, it falls, right? Now, when you anesthetize it, the one at the bottom, you see now? Now that it's fully anesthetized, you touch it, look, it just doesn't move. It's anesthetized, okay? So it's sensitive to anesthetics, right? The same happens with respect to coming out of anesthesia. If you think, to me, what's really revealing is not the fact that you can be anesthetized. It's to think what it means. What does it take to come out of anesthesia? Think about it. So coming out of anesthesia means, in a sense, recovering something that you had lost temporarily. So if you look at the third picture, you see a plant now that has come out of anesthesia, bottom right, it starts to fold, if only more slowly. So it's still like sort of the anesthesia is wearing off. It's kind of, you know, coming out of anesthesia. It's like whoa, what's happening here? I'm slowly coming out of anesthesia. I'm again folding, but at a pace, more clumsily. I'm still not fully back to normal. So what does it mean to come out of anesthesia, to be back to normal? Doesn't it mean to be able again to perceive the external world, to have exteroception, to have interoception, to have proprioception? And wasn't exteroception, interoception, and proprioception what we meant by minimal consciousness, by that level of sentience minimally required to speak of biological sentience? You see, we are speaking of the effect of anesthesia, we are speaking of the role of neurotransmitters, and yet we are not speaking of animal models once we've enlarged the criteria to be applicable to non-animal organisms, right? What happens with learning? Remember, integration, anesthetics, learning. We know strawberries. We know we can train them. We can train them to associate high light intensity with rich soil patches, or with low light intensity with those rich soil patches. So we can teach them to associate one type of a stimuli or the other, and they will grow. They will grow one way or another. Some other studies have spoken of associative learning in which you associate a fang, like some sort of air flow being sent to the plant with light, and by pairing those two, the plant will be growing towards the fang, expecting that the light will come next, right? This is something we are in the process right now of replicating. It hasn't been replicated yet. That's what I meant about being extra cautious. So this is far too recent research, and we want to be cautious. But if you see, I'm not talking about what we know. I'm talking about the theoretical framework that in principle could be applied to study those competencies, regardless of the outcome. Because what's really important is to say, well, hold on a sec, if these results get replicated, and we know that strawberry can learn to associate those two things, and we know that pea plants can learn to associate those two things, then we might wonder whether that is an indicator that can be used to speak of plant sentience, right? Well, in fact, we can do way more than that. Even when those studies are replicated, assuming they get replicated, then we can speak of, oh, how far can we go? Well, we know that the more intense the condition and the unconditioned stimuli are, the greater the effect of the training. We know that the shorter the interval, the greater the effectiveness of the training, right? So we know we can try many different things to see how robust those results are, right? Think of the interstimulus interval. This is an interesting example because Jonathan Birch, Eva Jablonka, and colleagues, when they have offered or proposed this set of criteria to investigate sentience in the animal kingdom, they were speaking of enhanced forms of associative learning. One enhanced form of associative learning is trace conditioning. Why? Because in trace conditioning, you don't find an overlap in between the presentation of the condition and the unconditioned stimuli. So there is like a temporal gap. So that's why it's called trace conditioning, right? You've got to keep trace of that as you get to receive the second stimuli. So if there is trace conditioning, there is some trace being retained by the organism. And that's a good entry point. That's a good reason someone might have to suspect that those organisms are sentient to some extent, if they are able to exhibit an enhanced form of associative learning such as trace conditioning. So you see, something that we used to think belong exclusively to mammals with a neocortex, or to birds, corvids. We know corvids are so smart. Now we know that even Drosophila, the fruit fly, has it. So this is a study in which it's been shown a couple of years ago that the fruit fly exhibits trace conditioning. So with this temporal gap in between the presentation of the stimuli. Oh, trace conditioning in Drosophila. So does it mean that Drosophila, the fruit fly, has much fits the bill when it comes to this indicator? And on top of that, if there is integration, there is sensitivity to anesthetics, trace conditioning, do Drosophila have sentience? Well, if those are the indicators, it is the very same type of indicators we can be using, not just in invertebrates, but in non-neural organisms, right? Yeah, no, I wanted to spend at least a few more minutes to say something else. And I think this is important to, especially to PhD students and researchers that come from different fields. Why? Because far too often we don't give too much thought to the school of thought in which we have been raised. And we don't give too much thought to the paradigm in which we have been educated and what we can do from there, right? And I'm mentioning all this because if we said, let's study plants from within the cognitive sciences, those cognitive sciences are usually constructivist by default. So cognitivist schools of thought in which we say, oh, let's study cognition. And what does it mean to study cognition? Some people think, okay, we need to find out, identify the algorithm, the recipe book, right? Or we need to enrich the environment because the environment is inherently poor. And enriching the environment is what you do when we explain cognitive-based visual processing, right? You say, oh, a 2D image in my retina, I need to enrich it. That's too poor. I need to construct, to build, to make up a 3D model out of the 2D image on my retina, right? So we have all these models that students for generations and generations have been educated into, but we don't give too much thought to this. We just assume that to study cognition means that you have to do it from a cognitivist framework, in which you're assuming that we are representational, that we are computational, that we follow by default, I insist, a constructivist framework. We need to be doing something in here because the environment is not going to give you the solution to the problem. It's something we do here. We cognitively come out of the problem. We make decisions. We memorize. We do things in our heads, right? And that framework is something that we should be questioning, not because we know it is wrong, but we should be, and this is to me the lesson for students, we should be open to exploring any paradigm whatsoever. Different schools of thought might give you different entry points, might allow you to raise different set of questions. And that's always enriching, regardless of the outcome, regardless of who is right or who is wrong, right? So if we go for a more ecological type of psychology, not a constructivist psychology, let me show you what you can do. Well, first, for one thing, we are not speaking of a representation in the organism's head. We are simply speaking of the interaction of the organism with the surroundings and the direct perception of the possibilities of interaction. So when you are someone perceiving someone else that you can talk to, you are perceiving talkability. or where you are perceiving this stone as a stone that I could sit onto, a rock I could sit onto, I'm perceiving sittability. So it's not something sitting in my head, you are perceiving the affordances, what the environment is affording you to do. So it has to do with interaction. Another way to put it is that the unit of analysis is not the organism itself or is inside the head. The one and only unit of analysis is the organism with the environment as such, the coupling as such. And then when you speak of the coupling as such, many times you find that the environment wasn't that poor after all. It was a matter of finding the right type of interaction in between the two, right? So think about this. This is a petal of a flower. When you see the petal under UV light, this is what you see. And why do we want to see it under UV light? Well, because that's the way pollinators will see it. And this is a pattern of coevolution. Plants have co-evolved with pollinators, and they have evolved these nice stripes that you see under UV light as the pollinator would see them, because that way, this is what the pollinator encounters. That's the flower the pollinator sees. And why is this flower intriguing? Because it's providing the landing cues. This is what is giving the pollinator, right? Is helping the pollinator land onto the petals. So the pollinator is perceiving landability, a surface where I can land, right? Now, why this is important? Because I said this is a pattern of coevolution. But again, we apply our zoocentric eye, animal-centric eye, and we speak of the pollinator perceiving landability. But it is the very same thing that you encounter when it is a plant, the organism, our main actor. So a plant perceiving a pole doesn't need to have a representation of the pole in its head. It can be simply perceiving climbability. The same way the pollinator is perceiving landability, the plant is perceiving climbability. The capacity to climb, provided the type of interaction, given the type of body I have, given the size and the scale of the pole, in the interaction itself, I perceive directly climbability, the possibility to be climbable. You see? Now we are applying the same thing, but we are not treating the plant as an object. We are treating the plant as the agent perceiving those possibilities of interaction. So that's what's happening when you see an ecological psychology from an anthropocentric perspective. This is a human walking around and perceiving possibilities of interaction with the table, with the tree, right? But in the case of Drosophila, think of the fruit fly we just saw, able to perform enhanced associative learning. So the fruit fly being able to perform enhanced associative learning that we suspect is a window onto its form of sentience is also able to navigate its surroundings by generating this optic flow, right? So it's flying on this corridor and it's generating an optic flow as the image is moving with respect to its eye, right? So we just need to think of the plant doing likewise. So if you move in this forest, and this is the optic flow that you are generating, that's the type of information you are receiving, and that's how you interact with it, you just need to swap roles and think, as in the pattern of coevolution in between the plant and the pollinator, that the plant itself is also an agent growing. So it's generating this flow not by locomotion, but by growth. So a plant that grows also is able to generate this flow. We don't need to see the trees as simply the objects and the animal, the one flying or locomoting. Remember the case of robotics, inspiration for robotics. We can inspire our robots in plants that grow. A plant that grows also generates this optic field, right? This energy flow as it's encountering, as it's approaching the target. So, well, actually, remember the case I told you of the ratios of red to far red light or blue to green light, right? So if I'm growing and I see the ratio going down, the ratio of red to far red, what does it mean that the ratio goes down? it means that there are guys in the vicinity absorbing red. So when the ratio goes down, it means, oh, I'm being shaded. I better walk out. I better grow in a different direction. So if you think of a plant doing this, a plant growing around, what the plant is doing is saying, oh, if I grow in this direction, the ratio goes down. If I grow in this direction, the ratio goes up. If I'm circumnutating, remember the pattern of circumnutation we saw at the beginning, by circumnutating, I can see what happens to those ratios. Now you see the possibilities of interaction directly. So you see what I mean? I'm not making pictures, images, representations being stored in my head. There is no need for a head or neural tissue to be storing that information. You just need to be behaving, interacting with the surroundings. And out of that direct interaction, those possibilities emerge. The direct perception of climbability or shadeability or whatever it is that you are doing. I think we can leave it there, Jürgen. Yeah, sorry if it took a little bit too long.